got back to England, James Banks was the publicity hound, got all the publicity, so I thought, okay, I'll go back, I'll read the newspapers, I'll see who got the most publicity. And it was a goat. A single goat. She was a nanny goat, she was a very, very stroppy goat. On her first trip around the world, she'd already butted overboard the king of Tahiti, and she gave milk for the entire voyage. But also, if it hadn't been for Captain Cook's goat, we wouldn't be here, because the Endeavour was just one ship. And when Cook, everyone, not everyone, but look, Cook had a map showing Australia was here. James Cook did not discover America. There have been many, many explorers here, including people living here for about 60,000 years. But what he did do was bring Joseph Banks, who was an amateur and absolutely terrible botanist, but who was a very good publicist for botany. He brought him along the East Coast, and later Sir Joseph Banks, totally inaccurate picture of what the East Coast was like, would send the English settlement to what we now have as Australia. But if it hadn't been for the goat, they wouldn't have made it. Cook had been ordered not to sail up Australia. They knew about the Great Barrier Reef, they knew it was dangerous. Cook had been told that he either had to sail South Australia or follow Tasman up the north where it was safe. But instead, he wanted to map new land. He went completely against the orders, and he took this single ship up the dangerous coast of Australia, the dangerous east coast of Australia. And they were right to tell him not to, because they got wrecked on the Great Barrier Reef. And it was desperate. They were too far from land to swim, because sailors then couldn't swim. They didn't have enough ship's boats for most of the people. Everyone would have died. Or most people would have died. Some of the officers probably could have got away. They started pumping. They pumped and they pumped and they pumped. They kept pumping for so long that the men could only pump for 3 minutes. Then they would collapse and more men would take over. And it was obvious they could not keep pumping. It was obvious that they were doomed. But a young man called Jonathan Monkhouse came up with an absolutely impossible plan. But they were desperate. He said, why not put manure, dry manure, on a sail? They would wrap the sail under the hull of the ship where the hole was. They would pack it with dry manure, and as the dry manure, the goat manure and the sheep manure, sucked the water up, it would make an almost watertight seal, and they might just be able to sail the ship to the coast of Australia where they could repair it. It was impossible. You can't repair a ship with goat poo. But he did. It worked. They managed to get the Endeavour to the mainland, even more miraculously. There was fresh water, there was a safe beach for them to repair the boat. But if it hadn't been for that goat, we wouldn't be here now. And when they finally got back to England, after the goat had given milk for the entire voyage, she was a heroine. The British Parliament met especially to commend the goat, to make her a life pensioner of Greenwich, and to award her a silver collar with words in Latin on it. When she died, Samuel Johnson wrote an epitaph in Latin in the Times. But she never did have to become a pensioner at Greenwich, because the one thing that James Cook took home after a three-year voyage was the goat. An elderly, stroppy nanny goat was the one thing that he brought back from his voyage around the world. And so that is the story of the voyage from the point of view of both the goat and the boy who would later become an admiral, whose duty it was to care for her. Any other ones you'd like me to talk about? Yes. The camel who got, well, the camel, when I was your age, I was told that Burke and Will were heroes, they were explorers. In fact, they were neither. They were absolute twits, particularly Burke. They could have taken have arrived, rested. Instead, they actually hauled their way through desert, even if they didn't have to do it. Every possible thing they did wrong, including when the local indigenous people tried to give them food, Burke shot at them. And these were just people trying to give them fish. Here, please, you are starving, eat. And instead he would shoot at them. So the camel who crossed Australia tells the story of that expedition from the two people who did know what they were doing. Dost Muhammad, who was what we'd now call it Afghani, but then it was the northwest frontier, the Afghani cameleer. And again, this is a real person, and I based it as far as possible on what I was able to research of his background. And the camel Bill Singh, who was the only camel to survive the expedition. And as I put in the book, I do believe, in fact, that Dost Muhammad let Bill Singh go. I think Dost Muhammad realised towards the end of the expedition that all of the camels were going to die because of the stupidity of Burke. And I think he decided that he would let one go, so that one at least might survive. So again, it's a true story, but it's certainly not the story that was in the history books when I was a kid. How are we going for time? Okay, another one? Yes.
The Matilda saga?
Matilda. Do any of you know the song, Waltzing Matilda? Okay. I've always loved that song, but a few years ago, I suddenly listened to it again and I thought, hey, wait a minute. There's something funny about that song. Just think about it. Once Johnny Swagman camped by Billabong, under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till the belly boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, that's okay. Up came a squatter, mounted on a thoroughbred. Down came the troopers, 1, 2, 3. Where's that jolly jumbuck you've got in your tucker bag? You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Now, Waltzing Matilda was inspired by a real story. During the shearer strike up near Winton, a shearer turned swaggy called Frenchie Hoffmeyer was suspected of burning down a shearing shed. And look, he was almost certainly guilty. He boasted at several pubs, I didn't, but they will never get me for it. There were no witnesses. Banjo Patterson, who wrote the poem, was staying at the McPherson's place near there. He heard the story of what had happened to Frenchie Hoffmeyer, and he wrote the poem about it. But people back then would have heard it very differently from the way we listen to it now. Down came the squatter mounted on the thoroughbred. Up rode the troopers, 1, 2, 3. The police area near Winton was 26,000 square kilometres, and there were only 23 troopers for that entire area. So how likely is it that just as the swaggy stuffs the jumbuck in his tucker bag, the troopers and the squatters ride by? It's a bit of a coincidence. But also, how did the swaggy stuff a jumbuck in a tucker bag? Anyone here ever tried to stuff a sheep in a tucker bag? I used to be a sheep farmer. I was once dragged half a kilometre down a dirt road, holding on to the hind leg of a stocky but valuable ram. Trust me, you don't go stuffing a jumbuck in a tucker bag. In fact, you can't even catch a sheep unless possibly you're a champion footballer and you can actually run and take a flying tackle, or preferably you've got sheep yards and a couple of dogs who really know what they are doing. You don't go and stuff a jumbuck in a tucker bag, unless the jumbuck was a poddy. Now, a poddy lamb is a little orphan lamb, and they're so cute, they wiggle their tails and they're beautiful, and you feed them biscuits, and they'll come into the kitchen, they'll eat your toast, and even when they grow up to be a great big smelly jumbuck, they think they're a dog or a human, not a sheep. Even when they're a big smelly jumbuck, if you're going for a picnic and they're 3 kilometres away and you open your sandwich, they'll come galloping along to share your lunch with you. rid of it. And that, I think, is what happened. And I suspect anyone hearing that song back in the 1890s and the early 1900s, that is how they would have heard it. Because it would have been a setup. The sentence for stealing a sheep was pretty much the same for burning down a shearing shed. He would have got between 3 and 6 months. It would have been justice of a sort. It would have toned down the violence. They were very worried that the violence was going to spread, more shearing sheds would have been burnt. They wanted to stop the violence. They wanted to make an example of him and give him 3 months' prison for sheep stealing. But something went wrong. Up jumped the swaggy and sprang into the billabong. "You'll never take me alive," said he, and his ghost may be heard as he passed by the billabong. "You will come a-waltzing, Matilda, with me." It's a cry of a man who will not be taken for a crime he did not commit. It is a crime of extraordinary defiance. And that's what the 1890s were like. Look, never ever think that the story of how we became a nation is boring. It's not. It was a time of extraordinary passion. It was a time of the worst drought that Australia has ever known. From 1878 to August 1903, in many parts of Australia, it did not rain. It was extraordinarily bad. It was so bad that people realised that the only way for Australia to survive economically was to unite. The squatters united to try and force down the wages of the shearers. Politicians united, thinking that if we got rid of the tariffs between the states, if we started to actually trade as one nation instead of a collection of states, economically we might survive. Men like Parkes gave speeches around Australia. But the real heroines were in fact the women of the temperance and suffrage movements, and for a very, very different reason. Things were so bad back then, and if you read A Waltz for Matilda, that's where it starts, where Matilda is working a jam factory, because as the conditions got bad in the cities, things were so bad that factory owners sacked the adults and started to employ kids, often for no wages at all. They would work, many of them never saw daylight. Many of them didn't get wages, they only got their food. Most of them didn't live to adulthood. They would sleep in the dirt of the factory. And conditions were so horrendous that the women of the temperance and suffrage movements thought that the only way to get rid of child labour was to have a new federal parliament where women would have the vote. For every speech that Henry Parkes gave, the women of the temperance and suffrage movements gave at least 100, if not 1,000, and they were indomitable. To have the referendum in every state to vote whether Australia should become one country or to stay states, every state needed enough signatures on a petition. But the women weren't allowed to sign the petitions, because except in South Australia, women didn't have the vote. So the women of the temperance movements, armed only with their umbrellas and their hat pins, went to the pubs, and they waited until the pubs closed and all the men came out too drunk to know what they were signing. And they got tens of thousands of signatures. We may be very happy to think of ourselves as the sons and daughters of Henry Parkes, constitutional lawyer. We may be less happy to think of ourselves as the sons and daughters of the women's temperance movement. But they were unstoppable, and they won, because one of the first things the new parliament passed was votes for women, and now you do have to go to school. You don't